everybody, Brittany Miller here to give you your weekly updates for the Center for OBC. And our updates this week are very focused on some insights that came out of a study that the SCALE initiative at Stanford University did. It's a part of the larger umbrella that NSSA, or National Student Support Accelerator, sits within. And so with that, I thought that it would make sense to have somebody from our insights team here. So we have a celebrity guest for today, Elise Lenthe. So Elise, can you just tell us a little bit about what came out of that NSSA study?
Yeah, so first I'm going to just share like a tiny bit of context about what they did. So the team at NSSA looked at more than 100 contracts, and it was a mix of outcomes-based contracts from districts that we've supported, non-outcomes-based contracts, like regular contracts from districts that we've supported, and regular non-outcomes-based contracts from providers that have done OBCs with districts we've supported. So it's kind of this Venn diagram of districts we've worked with, providers we've worked with, and the overlapping piece is the OBCs. They looked at all of these contracts to try and understand the role that elements of high quality contracting and OBC played in trends around the elements of outcomes-based contracting and high quality contracts. One of the things that came up really early on in the analysis, as they started developing the coding schema they were going to use for their review, when they asked, like, well, what is a high quality contract? It turned out there wasn't really a common definition of that. And so they actually ended up more or less using the standards of excellence as the review criteria, or I should say an early version of the standards of excellence, because this was happening concurrently with when we were developing the tutoring standards of excellence.
Thanks, Elise. So I think the thing that I want to call out there that's really important is there wasn't previously any empirical evidence, meaning like any, research that was demonstrating whether or not contracting was of quality in K-12 schools for instructional services, right? We have been saying like, districts buy things and they don't really know what they're buying. And so that's why OBC is necessary, right? But there was no actual research that had actually done the work to confirm to what degree that was happening. And so this research from the SCALE initiative at Stanford, or NSSA, really does focus in there and make it much more clear that this is a real problem in K-12. And because the standards of excellence exist, we now actually have a way to measure the quality of contracts when it comes to instructional services and procurement for the product lines where we've done our research. So that's another really exciting part of this, is that we can, as a field now, continue to build on this in terms of like, what should high quality procurement in instructional services for districts and providers look like? And that's a huge win, because whether or not it's the exact elements of an outcomes-based contract, we can start to see this is what we should be looking for when we look for quality in contracting for instructional services for students.
Yeah, and I think one of the other really interesting things, before we even get to like what % of contracts meet a given bar for quality, one of the interesting things that came out of some of the background research that NSSA SCALE did was around like what's even the point of contracts? Because when we started talking about, our contracts meeting their goals, it's like, well, what is a good contract supposed to do?
Exactly.
And NSSA kind of identified two buckets, and I think OBC helps contracts be better at both of these things. So the first bucket is contracts are public record. We say this all the time, right? They show where public funds are being spent. And that includes like, why was a particular provider picked for this contract? So rationale for picking the provider was one of the things they looked at. Contracts are a record of public dollars. The other thing that contracts can do when they're well developed is serve as a roadmap for implementation success. And that's another thing that very often they don't do, like in a traditional contract that's just a template with maybe a one-page attachment of the scope of work. That is not a roadmap for anyone. That is solely a legal document. But if a contract is set up and structured well, it can be a roadmap. So not only does it show where the dollars are going, but it creates this path for those dollars to have an impact.
I love that roadmap idea that you really do see in the outcomes-based contracts in terms of like, how do you make sure that everybody knows what they're in charge of doing and what the implementation criteria are in order to get to the ultimate success of the student outcomes that we all know are possible for kids. So that's been really helpful. I think that in order to make sure that we're keeping this nice and short for our folks, we'll put a link to the research page for NSSA. And then there's an infographic. So I'll just screen share it so you can see what it looks like that came out with the full article. And so here is that that one pager. And so you can see it goes through what outcomes-based contracts can do in terms of having the potential to better align with student outcomes, right? This part right here made Elise and I both really excited, which is, payment tied to student outcomes, 100% in outcomes-based contracts, and then, a much lower amount in traditional contracts. And so a real goal to increase that number of contracts that have payment tied to student outcomes so that we can start to align all the incentives across the system in order to achieve what we need to do for students. Elise, anything you want to add before we sign off?
I'll just say one more thing because it's hard to see in this level of Zoom, but I think it's exciting and ties to what we said earlier. Those 5 buckets in that bar chart that Brittany's showing are essentially the 5 ingredients of OBC: clear outcomes, clearly defined population, contingent payments, mutual accountability, and continuous improvement. They're not called that, but that's what they are. And so you can really see how those blue bars are the OBCs have that. And this also reflects like our own learning of, over the last year or so, we've really strengthened the mutual accountability and continuous improvement pieces of our contract, which are those far right buckets. You can see here, they're a little lower. That's been another learning for us. So it's not directly tied to the contract analysis, but I think it just goes to show like how all of our learning is kind of mutually reinforcing.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Elise. I'm going to go ahead and take that down so we can sign off. And with that, we're really excited to be able to share this with you. So please take a look at it on your own. And then for those of you that are getting this message from social, would love for you to also join us for our convening that's coming up in September, from September 17th to 19th in Orlando, Florida. And we're going to have a session actually on this particular research study so that you can learn more about this and all the other insights that we're getting from our work across the country.
Yep. The case for change. What contract analysis tells us about student-centered procurement.
That's the title of the session, just in case you're wondering. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will see you soon.